really wish I could cover more on this show, but I just don't have the time to record everything. But I did want to say that I've been watching DC's Legends of Tomorrow, and I'm really enjoying it. It's a show that I turned on the first episode thinking very dismissively that, well, I'll give this a try, I'll see what it's like, and I got sucked in. And I don't love every single episode. I think it's also worth mentioning that I've only watched the first season of Arrow, and I have yet to watch any of Flash. I plan to do something about that, but I'm not going to binge watch it because I don't binge watch TV shows. I don't binge watch anything. But I'm really enjoying the first season of DC's Legends of Tomorrow. I love the whole time travel element and the jumping around. I love the interactions of the different characters. And I think they've done a really good job of mixing things up. There's some episodes that are really great. There's been a couple that have been kind of so-so. But especially since the break, since they started up again for the second half of the season, starting with episode 9, and I've only watched through episode 10 at this point. I believe there's 11 episodes out, and I think there are only going to be 16 altogether. But so far, those first 2 episodes after the break, episodes 9 and 10, I thought were awesome. They really went some places. They've done some interesting things with the show, explored some interesting things, brought in some characters from DC Comics that I wasn't necessarily expecting to see. And so I'm not getting spoilery in here, I don't think, unlike the rest of the episode. But I think it's a great show, and I'm enjoying it, like I said, even though I'm not all caught up on Green Arrow and Flash. Dave Talks Comics, episode 110, Justice League Unlimited, Season 3, Part 1. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, the program where I talk about comic books I have read, cartoons I have watched, and comic book conventions to which I've gone. All past episodes can be streamed or downloaded from the program's website, davetalkscomics.com. On this episode, I'm going to be talking about JLU Season 3, Episodes 1 through 4. This will be Part 1 of what will probably be a 3-part, maybe a 4-part series on Season 3 of Justice League Unlimited. This is, unlike the first 2 seasons, which were linked together by the Cadmus story arc, this season is a new arc, and there is an arc that goes through the season. So it's a new season, it's a new story. I think there's some great ideas in here, and I think there's some great animation, but it wasn't always exactly what I was hoping for or what I was ready to accept, and so I didn't love all the episodes equally. So some of these episodes I'm going to focus on, probably spend a little more time on than other ones. I will be going into some detail about the episodes. I won't be spoiling everything, but I'm sure that there are some spoilers in there in case you haven't watched these episodes yet. The first episode of Season 3 is called I Am Legion. It is written by Dwayne McDuffie. Dwayne McDuffie is probably best known for co-creating the Milestone universe, which was eventually acquired by DC Comics and included, well, the best known character from that universe is Static, who was the main character of the cartoon Static Shock, which I've watched a little bit of. I've seen certainly the 2 crossovers with the Justice League, and I've seen a number of other episodes of it. I don't own it on DVD. I think it's available on DVD. I don't own it. I haven't seen it all, but I've seen a number of episodes. It's a really good series if you enjoy this. Although it certainly it's a teenage character, so it's a little different. And then, of course, Dwayne McDuffie was also worked on JLU quite a bit as both a writer and a producer. And, of course, as I mentioned, he's credited as the writer of this episode. And I say it that way because, as I understand it, quite often with TV shows, one person would do the bulk of the writing, but then an episode would get rewritten. And so really there's multiple people who work on it, but one person's name goes on the episode. So there's probably plenty of episodes that Dwayne McDuffie worked on, but that his name is not on as a writer. So this episode, like I said, brand new season, brand new storyline, but it does continue. It does pick up on some of the things that they left off with at the end of season 2. It opens with Lex Luthor breaking out of prison. Well, actually, not out of prison. I think it's he's being transported between prisons. And he breaks out and he gets chased by the police. He escapes, but he's almost caught. But he escapes because another villain intervenes, a villain named the Key, who, from what I've learned, I'm really not familiar with this character. I suppose I could have looked him up in Who's Who or online, but I didn't. But from what I gather from this episode, his specialty is unlocking things. So he helps Luthor to escape from the police. And at this point, the police did not get the League involved in transporting him, and the League give the police a hard time about that when they find out what happened and that Luthor has escaped. One of the people who shows up at this point when the police are trying to catch Luthor is King Faraday. King Faraday is a character who previously showed up in the season 2 episode of JLU called Double Date. And I talked about that on episode 65. I also talked about some background on Faraday towards the end of episode 65. So Luthor escapes into the swamps with the Key. Well, that's where the Key takes him, into the swamps, to meet up with another villain, Gorilla Grodd. And apparently Gorilla Grodd has this secret hideout in the swamp. And this whole thing at this point becomes, once you see it, well, if you're familiar with the past, if you're familiar with the Super Friends season called Challenge of the Super Friends, this is a big callback to that season in which the Super Friends were constantly going up against the Legion of Doom, which was basically the evil version of the Super Friends or the Justice League. I've gone back and watched a few episodes from that season. Honestly, like some of the old comic books, you really have to watch that season with keeping in mind that these cartoons were definitely intended for younger viewers, and they're not at the same level of sophistication as something like Justice League or Justice League Unlimited is. Anyhow, Luthor meets with Grodd. Grodd wants Luthor to join his group, which they don't specifically call, I don't think they called them the Legion of Doom. But Luthor isn't interested. He's still thinking about Brainiac. He's not just thinking about Brainiac, but he's also talking to him. He sees him, and he hears Brainiac speaking to him. And at first, it's not entirely clear. In fact, when I first went back to watch this, I saw him saying things, and I wasn't exactly picking up on what was going on. But then when I went back and watched it a second time, it became very clear that Luthor is talking to Brainiac. Or he's talking to somebody else, and that somebody else is Brainiac. Somebody who is not visible for the most part in this episode. But then every once in a while, they'll actually show Brainiac as Luthor sees him, which is as he appeared before he merged with Luthor back towards the end of season 2 of JLU. But nobody else can see him. It's just Luthor that sees him. So Luthor isn't interested in joining the Legion of Doom or whatever it's called, Grodd's organization, Grodd's club of supervillains, until Grodd shows him that he has the only known remnant, the only known piece of Brainiac. and that you see Luthor's eyes pop wide open, and you can hear Brainiac talking to him and telling him that he would be able to replicate Brainiac if he had that one piece. So this is kind of like DNA, I guess. And I think this has been mentioned before, because I think this came up in that episode, that Luthor and Brainiac episode, Ghost in the Machine, I think it was called, which was not a JLU episode, but a Superman the Animated Series episode, which I talked about on I think it was on the Cadmus story, Cadmus Concluded, which would have been episode 87 of the podcast. And I think at that point, that also came up, this idea that if one piece of Brainiac survives, he can be recreated from that one little piece. I guess because there's the DNA, or whatever you want to call it, in that piece to replicate him and to bring him back, and that he would, it's almost magical in some ways, because it's like he would have all of his memories and everything stored in there. So Luthor agrees to join the League, or the Legion, or whatever you want to call it, to join Grodd's club. But Grodd doesn't entirely trust him, and so he sends him on a mission. And he sends him, along with the Key and another villain, Dr. Polaris, to Black Hawk Island. Now, I should mention before I get into this that they do show a whole bunch of villains, although I don't think any of the others, I don't recall if any of the others have any speaking parts, other than the Key and Grodd and Dr. Polaris. I don't think any of the others have a speaker, but they show a whole bunch of them at one point. So Luthor goes with the Key and Dr. Polaris to Black Hawk Island, which was the headquarters for the Black Hawks, and I'll talk a little bit about the Black Hawks towards the end of this, but it was the headquarters for the Black Hawks, but it was abandoned. The Black Hawks were a group that was mostly active during World War II. And in the years following World War II, but of course at this point, World War II is over 50 years in the past, because this is the early 2000s at this point. But there's lots of weapons there, there's lots of equipment there at Black Hawk Island, and there's security systems to guard this equipment. And I think a lot of these weapons are things that were confiscated from villains in the past. So when the bad guys go into Black Hawk Island, it sets off some sort of an alarm, and there's one surviving member of the Black Hawks left, a guy named Chuck Sirianni. And he contacts the League, and he lets them know that something's going on, and so they agree to meet on Black Hawk Island. So the League sends Hawkgirl, who's on duty, Hawkgirl and Flash and Fire, who I don't think has been in, she may have been in the background of an episode before, of season 1 or 2 of JLU, but I don't think she had any speaking parts. I think this is the first time she actually gets, not really the spotlight, but she gets to be part of the main team. Or the team that's shown on the episode. Anyhow, Hawkgirl and Flash and Fire rendezvous with Chuck Sirianni on Black Hawk Island, and they're quickly attacked by a number of the weapon systems that were stored on the island, including a war wheel and flying mechanical sharks and a robotic squid, and I think there was one or two others. But the War Wheel is definitely something that came from the Black Hawk comic books, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. I'm not sure about the flying mechanical sharks or the mechanical squid. There's a very good possibility that they are, or they could just be things that are along the same lines as something that the Black Hawks encountered or somebody else encountered in comic books. The weapon systems are not easy to beat, but they do manage to beat the weapon systems. They do manage to knock them out, and then they fight with the villains who have shown up there, Dr. Polaris and the Key and Luthor. Ultimately, they beat the villains, but the villains manage to escape. But when they go into the vault to see what the villains took, there's only one box that's been opened, and then you see this look on Chuck Sirianni's face when he realizes which box it is that's open, and it's this look of shock. And what you learn after Luthor gets back to Grodd and gives him this thing, that it was the Spear of Longinus. Now, the Spear of Longinus is also known by the name of the Spear of Destiny. Now, the Spear of Destiny is supposed to be the spear that pierced the side of Jesus when he was on the cross, and was imbued with magical powers, just like the Holy Grail was supposed to be the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper, and was also supposed to be. And these are both things which have appeared in DC comic books in the past. In DC Special number 29, which I have and I've read, and I think it's been reprinted at least a few times, introduces the idea that that Hitler had the Spear of Destiny during World War II. I'm not sure exactly when he acquired it, but he used it to create this aura around continental Europe, which prevented some of the most powerful superheroes from going in there and defeating the Nazis. And they used this, and this story dates back to, I think, like 78, 79 is when the story came out, DC Special number 29. And they used this. This came up again in All-Star Squadron, which I think debuted in 1981, so just a few years later. And there's a really cool story in All-Star Squadron which brings in actually the Marvel family, Captain Marvel Jr., Mary Marvel, into All-Star Squadron. I think it's their only appearance in All-Star Squadron. It's issues 36 and 37. And in that issue, Captain Marvel has been hypnotized or is under control of Adolf Hitler and is attacking Britain. And so some of the All-Stars go to Britain to battle him, but then they have to go deeper into Europe, and so not all of them can go because Wonder Woman and Superman and Green Lantern are unable to cross the English Channel because it has something to do with their powers, that their powers are magically based, and therefore they can't go in. And I'm not going to try to go into too much depth other than that. But it's a really cool story, and it involves the Spear of Longinus, the Spear of Destiny, as it's also called. Getting back to this episode of Justice League Unlimited, there was a number of other things that really got me excited when I watched this. I got to say, when I first started to watch it, I thought it was just so-so at first, but it built, and there was just so many little things that they weaved in here that got me. I mean, first off, the Legion of Doom. I'm not sure if I knew that was coming the first time I saw this, which was when it first aired, but I thought that was really cool. Seeing Luthor converse with Brainiac, who isn't there, who's really only in his head, because after all, in the Cadmus story arc, at the end of the Cadmus story arc, Brainiac merged with Luthor and became part of Luthor, and they were one being. And so, and then it seemed like Brainiac was destroyed, but apparently Brainiac wasn't destroyed, and Luthor's still seeing Brainiac. And is it really Brainiac, or is it just Luthor's hallucinations? And I just love that kind of stuff. The return of the Blackhawks was really cool. The Blackhawks were previously seen in the Savage Time, which was the 3-part story that ended the first season of Justice League. Not Justice League Unlimited, but Justice League. And that was the story where the Justice League went time traveled back to World War II and had to defeat the Vandal Savage. And they teamed up with, among others, Sergeant Rock and Easy Company and the Blackhawks. So this is the first time that we've seen the Blackhawks since then. I think it's the only appearance. I think that's the only other appearance of the Blackhawks in Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. But still, I thought that was really cool. The weapon systems on Black Hawk Island, especially the War Wheel, were really cool. The flying mechanical sharks I just thought were nuts. I even went through a number of issues online. I looked through a lot of the covers of Black Hawk looking for those mechanical sharks. I found some information on the War Wheel, but I couldn't find anything on mechanical sharks or mechanical squids or robotic squids or however you want to describe them. And then the final thing that I liked in this episode was some of the relationship stuff that you got going between Hawkgirl and Flash and Fire, because it becomes very apparent when they first show them that Wally, Flash, is shy around Fire. Obviously, he's attracted to her, and Shaira, Hawkgirl, is teasing him about this and doesn't understand why he doesn't just go and talk to her. And then she kind of instigates things a little bit and kind of forces them together a little bit. I mean, nothing really happens in this episode between them other than conversation. But it's and of course what makes it even better is that Fire is completely oblivious to why Wally is acting the way he's acting. She doesn't realize that he has a crush on her, and so it's really I don't know, sweet in some ways, I guess, but it's really very funny, the whole thing. So I've got some notes on some other things that I wanted to talk about. Other things related to this episode. And I guess the place I should probably begin is, let's see, I already mentioned King Faraday. So, I mean, what I really want to talk about is the Blackhawks, the War Wheel, and Black Hawk Island. The Blackhawks and Black Hawk Island and the War Wheel, actually, can all be found in the original version of Who's Who. Black Hawk, Black Hawks, Black Hawk Island, the Black Hawk Plane, all of those are in the second issue of the original edition of Who's Who, the definitive directory of the DC Universe. The War Wheel appears in the 25th issue of that, which is a little surprising, since it's not a person or a team. Although there are some places, I don't know if there's any other instances of things, but the War Wheel was first appeared in Black Hawk number 56, which came out, was cover dated September of 1952, and was created by Professor Merson, who was a Nazi sympathizer. From what I read, it sounded like he was originally an American, or he was an American who changed sides and went over to the Nazi side. And there's not a whole lot else. I mean, there's some information in there about how they defeated the War Wheels, and the War Wheels, it wasn't just in issue 56 of Black Hawk. They also showed up a few more times, although I think it was quite a while before the War Wheels came back. But I've always thought that they were really cool, and one of the coolest, I guess, transportation devices that one could find. I could have sworn there was an appearance of a War Wheel in All-Star Squadron somewhere, but now I'm not sure where it is, and it's really hard to look those sorts of things up. I may have been thinking of some other story that I saw at some point. I'm just not sure. So talking about the Black Hawks, Black Hawk and the Black Hawks, Black Hawk was the leader of the group called the Black Hawk Squadron, and they first appeared in Military Comics number 1, which came out in August of 1941. It was a very popular comic. They first were appearing in Military Comics, and they later appeared in their own comic book called Black Hawk, which would run for over 200 issues, although... okay, let me put it this way. It would run for over 200 issues. It was continuously published from the 40s through the 60s. I believe from the mid-40s to the late 60s, mid to late 60s. But then it was discontinued. Then it was started up again in the mid-70s. I think it only lasted about 10 or 12 issues. It was canceled again, then it was brought back again in the early 80s, and there was some more of that back and forth. And I think the run that I would really like to read is the run from the early 80s, which I think it ran for about 3 years. But there's some stuff in there that looks kind of cool that I think I'd like. And that starts with issue 251 and I think runs through like 274 or something like that. So I guess that's about 2 years worth of issues, about 24 issues. But as far as their background, well, first I should say, if you're really interested in learning more about the Blackhawks, check out Wikipedia, because their background, their history has been rewritten a number of times. Like I said, they first appeared in Military Comics. It's a group of, the Black Hawk Squadron is a group of pilots who fought with the Allies in World War II. And it's an international group, so they're from all different countries. Some are American, Black Hawk himself was originally supposed to be Polish, but then he was later retconned to be a Polish American. So I'm not sure exactly what his status is or the status of the team is at this point. Like I said, or I'm not sure if I said this, but the book was originally published by Quality Comics. Now, Quality Comics was later acquired by DC Comics, and Black Hawk was, I believe, the only title that was not discontinued at that point. It was continued because it was so popular. They continued to publish it for I think over 10 years after they acquired it. A number of other characters who came from Quality Comics would be people like the Freedom Fighters, Uncle Sam, the Ray, the Black Condor, Doll Man, Phantom Lady, Plastic Man, Midnight, the Red Bee, and a few others who I'm sure I'm forgetting. Possibly some other members of the Freedom Fighters and possibly some other heroes. The second episode of Season 3 did not impress me, or I had problems with it. There's some ways that it does impress me. The animation I found to be very crisp, very clean, beautifully done. There's some great scenes, a lot of flying scenes. Hawk Girl is in this one. And, okay, so let me get into what the episode's about. It's called Shadow of the Hawk. And in it, a man approaches Shaira, Hawk Girl, introducing himself as Carter Hall. And that he is, I don't think he tells her this immediately, but what he comes out eventually and reveals to her is that he is what he does tell her initially is that he's an archaeologist and that he found an ancient Thanagarian sword or blade of some sort, and he presents it to her, and he suggests that they should talk, and it's kind of implied that she goes out on a date with him. She's playing along with him, even though Batman shows her evidence that he's been stalking her, that Carter Hall has been stalking her. And I don't know, part of this, what I haven't said, Carter Hall was the name of the Hawkman of Earth 2, the original Hawkman. In the original version of the original story of Hawkman and Hawkgirl were reincarnations of ancient Egyptian king and queen. And that's not the version that they've been going with up to this point in Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. Hawkgirl is a Thanagarian, which is the Silver Age version, which is the version, actually I believe both were written by the same person. I believe they were both written by Gardner Fox, but it was a complete rewrite of the idea of Hawkman. The original Hawkman was an American, but he was an Earthman who was an archaeologist who discovered evidence, who came to the realization that he was the reincarnation of this ancient king of Egypt. Well, I don't know if it was all of Egypt, but a king in Egypt, Prince Khufu. And eventually he meets Shira Saunders, who it turns out is the reincarnation of Khufu's lover, who I believe was Shaira. I'm not 100% certain on that. I haven't done the research. My problem with this episode is that it teases me that what we've been told so far is not correct, or that there's another dimension to it, and it doesn't jive in my mind. And I really like that version in the comic books, but I don't like it here. And part of what I don't like here, they imply that this guy Carter Hall, first off, they say that's not his real name. It isn't actually Carter Hall. And then they imply that he because he interfaced with an absorbicron, which is a piece of Thanagarian technology, that put images in his mind, which led him to believe that he was this reincarnation of this Thanagarian. Now, there is this Thanagarian spaceship which he has unearthed, which is thousands of years old. And so maybe there was some Thanagarians that arrived on Earth thousands of years ago. But there's really no evidence to support the idea that he is, and that Hall and Shaira are reincarnated lovers. And I find the whole thing to be very creepy, the way he just keeps on insisting that this is the case. And he doesn't push it to the point of violence, but his confidence in this is a little disturbing. I don't know. And I didn't like it. It was kind of creepy the way he keeps on insisting on this. Aside from the two of them, there are a few other characters in this episode. Green Lantern shows up early on. Batman plays an important role as he tails Shaira and Carter Hall when they go to Egypt, and he follows them to Egypt. Turns out there's also a bad guy there, the Shadow Thief, who is trying to get his hands on a lot of this Thanagarian technology and Thanagarian jewelry and gold and things like that, and is hoping to make money that way. And the whole fight scenes there, they go down underground. There's all this stuff there. I mean, it's beautifully done. It's beautifully animated, but the story itself just leaves me feeling a little weird. The best part of this episode, like I mentioned the animation, the other thing that I really liked was early on in the episode, there's some nice jibes or jabs in between Green Lantern and Hawkgirl, and Green Lantern says things to her. And Green Lantern makes references. He talks to Batman and makes references to the last episode of Season 2 of... Wait, was it the last episode of Season 2? No, it wasn't the last. It was the Once and Future Thing. That's what it was. The episode, the two-parter that was at the end of Season 1 of JLU, when Green Lantern and Batman ended up in the future, and he met his son, who was supposed to be, whose mother was supposed to be Shaira. And so they make some references to that. So I love that. And I love some of the back and forth between he and Shaira. He sees Shaira in this dress when she's about to go out on this date, and his eyes pop out, well, they don't actually pop out, but he is really taken, and she can tell, and she uses that, and it's all very well done. I really like that interplay between them. And I guess the final thing I will say about this episode is that I looked ahead and I can see that Carter Hall and the Shadow Thief do show up again. They return in episode 11, which is called Ancient History. And I did watch that when it first aired, but I have not watched it yet. I have not rewatched it yet. So I have no idea, and I can't remember exactly what happens there. So maybe there is some follow-up. Maybe this is setting something up. So hopefully there will be some resolution to this whole situation with Carter Hall and I guess the Shadow Thief. But on the whole, I'm not a huge fan. This episode did not do stuff for me the way the first episode did. The first episode got me so excited about the Legion of Doom and some of the other stuff where they're following up on the Brainiac and Luthor and the Spear of Destiny and the Blackhawks. And this one just didn't, it felt like it was trying to pull me in with some of these things, but it ended up leaving a sour taste in my mouth. And so I'm not a huge fan of this episode, even though there are some things in there, as I mentioned before, that I liked. But as I think about it a little more, a couple thoughts come to mind. One is that maybe there is a way they could have done this. They could have pulled in the original Hawkman story without making it so creepy. Maybe if it had been a dream sequence, and maybe if it had been Shaira discovering this stuff, instead of somebody bringing it to her and insisting that this is the way it was, maybe then I would have been able to, and I know sometimes people get very up in arms about things, somebody waking up at the end and discovering, oh, it was all just a dream, but sometimes those stories can be pretty good. Because my feeling is that they had already established Shaira's lineage or her heritage or her background, that she's an alien, that she comes from another planet. And now they're trying to bring in the ancient Egyptian version of this, and it has not worked well in the comic books to try and bring all of those elements together. And I don't think it works very well. I don't think it worked very well in this episode. And my other thought is, and this is really a crazy thought, but is that maybe this is Dwayne McDuffie's way of making some sort of because Dwayne McDuffie is credited as the writer on this one. Actually, it's Dwayne McDuffie, I think, and J.M. DeMatteis both worked on this. And maybe this is their way of saying something about how creepy the whole reincarnation idea is. I'm not sure. That's an even crazier idea, I think. That's definitely a crazy idea. Crazier than them being 100% upfront and honest about this. But hopefully in episode 11, which is called Ancient History, there will be some sort of resolution that will make me feel better about what was in this episode. The third episode of the Season 3 of Justice League Unlimited is called Chaos at the Earth's Core. In it, Green Lantern, Stargirl, Stripesy, and Supergirl, after an adventure in Japan, are flying back, I guess, to the U.S., because now that I think about it, shouldn't they have been flying back to the satellite? So why would... Yeah, that's a good question. Anyway, they're flying back to the U.S., I guess, and they're flying over the North Pole, and they get sucked into a hole and wind up in Skartaris, which is this world that exists underground. And this is a world that existed in the comic book Warlord, which I read a little bit of. But anyway, so they get sucked into this world, and they get involved in this battle between... they end up being allied with Travis Morgan, the Warlord, and his allies against the bad guy in this episode, Demos, who is getting some help from the Legion of Doom, specifically from Metallo and Silver Banshee, I believe is the other one. While there are a number of things that I like about this episode, ultimately... let me put it this way. I really liked the first part of the episode. I liked the part that took place in Japan, and I really liked it up to the point that they introduced Travis Morgan. And it wasn't that I hated that, it's just that the episode on the whole felt rushed. This one really felt like it would have benefited from being a two-parter. They would have needed more than what they put into this episode for the two-parter, but I'm sure they could have come up with more. They could have come up with another subplot or something, and I say that because everything, once the battle begins between Warlord, on the one side you've got Warlord, you've got the Leaguers, and against Demos and his allies, and his lizard men and other creatures, it's all just going so fast. It's just not very well plotted out. I mean, it just feels like they had a lot more that they wanted to include in this episode than they could possibly include, and have it all feel like it was paced out at a good, natural pace. I mean, one idea that I had was that if they had expanded it out to 2 episodes, that they could have had, like, a member of Warlord's team and a member of the League teaming up to achieve some goal in particular, and you could have seen the 2 of them for each team interacting. But unfortunately, we don't get that. So, unfortunately, I wasn't crazy about this one. The things I did like about this episode is that there's some nice back and forth between Stargirl and Supergirl. Stargirl gets very jealous of Supergirl. Supergirl stealing the spotlight when they're in Japan, and then that continues after they leave Japan and once they wind up in Skartaris, because one thing that happens in Skartaris is that Supergirl loses her powers, and so she ends up And I believe that's because they are underground, and so she is not being exposed to the sun. And after all, that's where her and Superman, some of their powers come from, is the fact that the Earth has a yellow sun, not a red sun, like Krypton did. So I enjoyed that, the back and forth, the banter between Stargirl and Supergirl. And there was a few other humorous moments that were good. And I appreciated this episode for what it could have been, and I think what they wanted it to be. And I really would have liked them to see them give the world of Skartaris the time to breathe a little more than they did in this one, 22-minute episode. Also worth noting is that the animation in this episode I didn't think was quite as good as in the last couple episodes. I thought it was a little rougher, not quite as fine-lined, not quite as pretty as it was in the last couple episodes. And as far as little changes that I noticed here is that Supergirl's costume, and I believe also her hair, had changed from the last time when she appeared in Season 2 of JLU. At that point, she had the white T-shirt and the blue miniskirt, and her hair was different. I'm not even going to try to describe her hair. I mean, it's not. I think it's a little longer now than it was before, and a little less neat than it was before. A little less not manicured. That's not the right word, but combed down, or I'm not sure exactly what the right term would be, but it's definitely a different look for Supergirl. I kind of prefer the other one. Maybe this one will grow on me. I'm not sure. But it was nice to see her, especially considering that she played a big role in the whole Cadmus storyline, because she was, after all, the Cadmus, they'd made a clone of her, and her battle with the clone was a big part of the ending of that storyline. So that's more or less it for Chaos at the Earth's Core. I wish I had more positive things to say about it. They do their best to get all of the Warlord, Travis Morgan supporting cast into here. A couple of them get lines. Some of them don't get lines. You only see them on screen. So, yeah, once again, it was kind of neat to see that stuff, but it really would have been better if they had given the world of Skartaris its due and made this a two-parter. The fourth and final episode that I'm going to talk about this time around is called To Another Shore. And this is probably my favorite of these 4 episodes. Although the first one I also really liked, in case that wasn't apparent from what I said before. This episode I've always thought about as the Viking Prince episode. And he isn't really in this episode, but he is in this episode. And the whole thing revolves around him in a way. And I couldn't remember exactly where this episode fell in the series. In fact, that's the case with a lot of these stories. I sometimes think that these episodes happen much earlier than they do. But this one, well, let me talk about this one first. And so in this one, an ancient Viking ship is discovered buried in the ice of a glacier. And it's believed that the Viking Prince is on board the ship. And the Viking Prince is a character from DC Comics, from ancient history. And I'll talk a little bit about that after I talk about the episode. So the Viking Prince is on board this ship, and they believe he's on board the ship because they recognize the sail on the ship they can see has his father's emblem, they say, on it. And I can't remember the name of his father, but the Legion of Doom sends Devil Ray, Giganta, Killer Frost, and Heatwave to retrieve this ship. And coincidentally, Wonder Woman is nearby at a global warming conference. She's there as a representative from Themyscira, a.k.a. Paradise Island. And she winds up getting into a fight with the villains because what the villains are doing ends up disrupting things at the threatening the conference goers, and so she steps in, And King Faraday also shows up at this point, and he's also in this. And they don't have a clash, the King Faraday and Wonder Woman, but they kind of have a meeting before that where he warns her about threatening the other members of the other attendees at this conference. But anyway, so she goes to try and she sees what the villains are doing. She doesn't know exactly what's going on, but she knows that they are threatening other people's lives, and so she's trying to stop them. And at first she's doing okay, but then, there's 4 of them against 1 of her. And so she ends up getting poisoned by Devil Ray, who shoots her with some needle that injects some poison into her bloodstream. And she's kind of woozy, and then King Faraday shows up with some of his G-men, his government agents. And at first that helps out, but then that's not enough, and so Wonder Woman finally calls to the Watchtower for help. And the Martian Manhunter and Green Arrow come down to help out. So the fight continues between the Leaguers and King Faraday and his men on the one side, and the Legion of Doom, the guys from the Legion of Doom. And I guess I should say, I've been calling them the Legion of Doom. They don't call them that in these episodes, but I need some term to hang on them. And that seems like the most logical to me. So Martian Manhunter tries to read Giganta's mind, because he's trying to figure out what the villains are doing there and why they're there and what they're trying to achieve. But all he gets is something about Viking Prince's invulnerability, and then Giganta's mind shuts down. So Devil Ray, using a submarine, Devil Ray manages to take off with the Viking ship, because Heatwave has been using his heat gun to melt the ice around the ship. And when things don't look like they're going well, Devil Ray decides, okay, that's good enough, and he takes off he harpoons into the ice and takes off with the ship, which is still frozen in a big block of ice. And I guess I should say also, Heatwave does not look like Heatwave in DC Legends of Tomorrow. He looks more like the classic version of Heatwave from like the 60s and 70s, and I guess into the 80s and maybe beyond in the comic books. Anyhow, Green Arrow makes his way onto the sub and almost captures it on his own. But in the end, he gets some help from King Faraday, and that proves to be the decisive factor. Meanwhile, Martian Manhunter has to convince Killer Frost to use her powers to save the conference attendees from an avalanche. And then finally the episode ends with the Viking Prince being laid to rest. You never actually see him come back to life. And Martian Manhunter leaving the League. So those are the 2 things that close the episode. Now, I really love this one. There's just so many great moments in this episode. There's a moment early in the episode where Wonder Woman confronts Martian Manhunter about his reluctance to go out on a mission, because ever since we went from Justice League to Justice League Unlimited, Martian Manhunter has been in the Watchtower, with a couple of brief exceptions, has been in the Watchtower directing things down on Earth for all of the superheroes who now make up the Justice League, or the JLU, and so Wonder Woman, is kind of giving him a hard time about that. He needs to mingle with others more. He needs to get out. I mean, not even just go down to Earth, but even go to the cafeteria on the satellite, on the Watchtower, and talk to other people. That he's kind of too drawn into himself, and that's a really good moment. And there's some really mature things there. I mean, not mature as in language or. Well, I guess in a way it's language because it's what they're talking about, but it's not the stuff that you would expect from a kid's cartoon. It really is. It's really some great moments. This scene is, and there's others, like you do get the story of the Viking Prince, and which is oddly enough told by Gorilla Grodd, because Gorilla Grodd is explaining to the other members of the Legion of Doom why they need to get this Viking ship that has been found in the ice. And his explanation is that the Viking Prince is somebody who was cursed by Odin, after the Viking prince fell in love with a Valkyrie, and he was banished from Valhalla and forced to roam the earth, and he was told he could only return to Valhalla when he had died an honorable death, but at the same time Odin made him invulnerable to fire, water, metal, or air. I'm not sure. Something else. I can't remember exactly what it was. And they use these still images from the Viking, I assume from the Viking Prince comics. I've never read any of them. And actually, he never had a comic under his own name. It was he was a feature in Brave and the Bold, and there's this one funny moment when Gorilla Grodd is telling the story of the Viking Prince, and he says, "And they fell in love," and it just sounds so incongruous for a villain like Grodd, who to talk about somebody falling in love. I don't know. I suppose it's a little. It's not fair in a way to assume that villains can't fall in love or aspire to something like that. But I just thought it was funny the way the note in his voice, the tone of his voice when he said that. There's other things that I really like about this episode. One other thing I wanted to say about the Viking Prince, that origin part, which only lasts a couple minutes, and they, like I said, they use these still images that are taken from. That looked like they were all done by Joe Kubert. They were probably taken from the original comics. It reminded me in a way of because the artwork is so much different from the rest of the episode. It reminded me in a way of that episode from the first season of Samurai Jack, when Samurai Jack and the Lava Monster, and where it turns out that the Lava Monster is actually this ancient Viking warrior. And he tells his story, and it's also done in a different art style. And both of those came out around the same time. I'm not sure which came out first, but it definitely made me think of that, the Viking connection, plus the fact that they used that technique of using a different look for the origin story of the warrior. There was a lot of good little quips in this episode, a number of them by Green Arrow, and I've got to say, Green Arrow, it seems like every episode that Green Arrow is in, I like. They're all good. I mean, there's good ones that don't involve Green Arrow, but it seems like almost every episode he shows up in is a really good one. My opinion, of course. And then finally, the other moment that I really loved and that honestly brought a tear to my eye was the ending when Wonder Woman is reading this. I'm not sure if it's a poem or if it's from the Viking Prince, one of the Viking Prince's stories in Brave and the Bold, but she's reading this something about the Viking Prince, I think, and at the same time they are giving him the burial that he wanted, because that's what he ultimately wanted, was to die. And, I mean, he's still frozen in this block of ice, but what they do is they push the block of ice, they take it out to space, and they send it on a course into the sun. And as she's reading this, you see his ship burning, his Viking ship burning up as it approaches the sun, and presumably he's burning up too. And at the same time, that's juxtaposed with the Martian Manhunter leaving the League indefinitely. And it's just very touching, very moving stuff. I think that's about everything for that episode. It really is my favorite of these first four, and it really is. There's just such a good mix of different things. You've got the action of the fights between the Leaguers and the members of the Legion of Doom, and so that's one thing. Then you have these more serious moments, like between Martian Manhunter and Wonder Woman at the beginning of the episode, and then Martian Manhunter leaving the League at the end of the episode. And then you've got these little quips in between, especially around Green Arrow, when he's fighting people. Sometimes something he says, sometimes it's something somebody else says. It doesn't always happen in a fight, but There's just all sorts of, it's just a very good mix of different elements. And this is probably what's missing from some other episodes, like Chaos at the Earth's Core. So a little bit of background about the Viking Prince. He was created by Bob Kanigher and Joe Kubert, and he first appeared in Brave and the Bold #1, which was cover dated August-September of 1955. And he was a regular in Brave and the Bold through issue 24. I think he appeared in all but one issue from issues 1 through 24. His next appearance was in a team-up with Sergeant Rock, when I think Sergeant Rock traveled back in time. I haven't read this story either. But it appeared in Our Army at War, numbers 162 and 163, which were dated January and February of 1966. Now, those were reprinted in Sergeant Rock Special #1, which came out in 1988. I have a few issues of Sergeant Rock Special. I don't have that one. But all of those, the issues, the stories from Brave and the Bold, plus the story from Our Army at War, are collected in The Viking Prince by Joe Kubert, which came out a few years ago, which is available on Amazon for the cover price is like $40, but you can get it for like $15 or less on Amazon right now, in April of 2016. The Viking Prince also showed up in some other stories since the 60s, most notably in a story in Arak, Son of Thunder, which I know was written by Roy Thomas. I can't remember who the artist was on that. And also he showed up in a Birds of Prey story. But like I said, I haven't read any of the comics, but I certainly, if for no other reason, the fact that it's a Kanigher and Kubert book, I'm certainly considering buying that. It's on my wish list of things that I want to get from things I want to get, things I want to read from that period of DC Comics. That's it for episode 110, and my coverage of the first 4 episodes of Season 3 of Justice League Unlimited. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the internet at davetalkscomics.com and facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. On Twitter at DaveTalksComics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.